there is absolutely no doubt about the size of the growth of some of these African countries. We've all read the reports, the Lions on the Move and the Africa's Turn and the $1 trillion opportunity. But where there are questions that are very important questions are around the quality of this growth. So, what is a merit behind it? Is it just a resource story, or people trying to push a consumption story? A growing middle class in Africa. And why is the question of the quality of the growth important? It's important because even when a country grows at 7% a year, it could be growth that is not inclusive, that is not bringing up the lower part of the economic pyramid, versus a growth like countries like Brazil or the Asian miracle in the 80s and 90s, where you actually have social mobility with that growth. So the question is about the quality and not necessarily the quantity of that.
So let's break that down a little bit for a minute, Arturo. Africa's growth, is 7-8%. Some countries. Generally, the growth rates are much higher than that of developed nations. Developed nations at the moment, in some cases, below zero, and or even just flat kind of growth. They aren't really growing, and that's the reason why everybody's really excited about the African continent. But the African continent's growth is off a very small base. Is that correct?
Yes, it's always easier to grow from a smaller base when an economy is far away from its potential. For example, in an economic crisis, the year after the crisis, countries tend to grow faster because they have production capacity that is not used during the year of the crisis, and then it gets used after the crisis. So the growth rate doesn't tell you the full story. I was talking about quality, and one thing is economic growth, but a very different thing is to talk about economic transformation.
Right.
And a big question in Africa is, are countries like Nigeria or Angola or Ghana finally going to transform their economies structurally, in a sense where we will see new industries develop, where we will see deeper supply chains developed, or is it just going to be a one sector led growth? And that is where Africa can learn from the experiences of, say, Singapore's or South Korea's growth models in the past. I was talking, the other side of the coin is, when you look at a country like Nigeria, it is set to grow at 6-7% in the next decade, which means basically multiplying the size of the country economically by 2. But if you go deeper into the growth, it is not clear that the resulting structural change in the country will be of an emerging middle class, as it was the case in, say, Brazil. Brazil grew at 5%, 5.4% during the last decade. But if you break it down by economic deciles, the lower two, the 20% of the population that was on the lower deciles grew at 10% during the same decade, and the upper deciles grew at 2%. So in a way, Brazil created a country the size of South Africa of middle class that didn't exist. And that is what I mean when I say the quality of that growth.
Right, just a final question. I know this is a very fascinating topic and we can go on, but just one final question. We are here at the International Entrepreneurship and Investment Conference. We wanted just a very quick word from you about the role of South Africa in these emerging markets, in the emerging economy of the African continent and the growth trajectory of the African continent. So it's the role of South Africa, and in particular that of KZN.
Yes. Well, I think South Africa is very well positioned to take a lead in the African continent. The world is focusing in on Africa. It's the turn of Africa, as it was Asia in the 90s and the BRICS in the 2000s. But the world needs translators. And South Africa can become a great bridge between the rest of the world and Pan-Africa, the greater Africa. But I also think that South Africa needs to take this role, both the government and the private sector, with more commitment. Striking a new relationship with the continent, and also using its capacity, the stage of development of the country, to attract the headquarters of many of these companies that want to come into Africa and use South Africa as a base for investment in the wider continent.
And KZN?
KZN has a lot of characteristics that make it a very good place to land for an international global corporation. One of them, it's the biggest, it has the biggest port in the southern hemisphere of the world, which means that you can actually manufacture and trade from here at low cost. And it's also well connected in other logistical ways, but it's also a good place to live, and that's very important for expatriates and global corporations.